Recently, I've been working on designing and building a custom kitchen for a client here in Barcelona. I decided to go with a full edge-grain butcher block style countertop that features a recessed sink and an integrated stovetop. Unfortunately, my workshop is at the end of a long alley, so we needed to move these 20 sheets by hand as the crane wouldn't fit inside. Alright, so let's get to it. After ripping the sheets lengthwise into more manageable pieces, I found a nice solution for ripping consistent widths of thin stock using my track saw. After ripping a clean and square edge on the plywood, I took this 3x3 centimeter block of oak, which I use as a spacer against the edge of the wood and the edge of my track. I have the battery-powered Mayfell track saw and usually get around 30 minutes of continuous use out of each battery, which conveniently is around the same amount of time it takes for the second one to charge. I also really like to use expanded polystyrene foam to support my cuts, as I don't have an MFT table. Its final dimensions will be around 2.8 meters long by 75 centimeters deep. I've calculated that I need around 70 strips of 18 mil ply in order to accommodate for the length, as the sheets only come in lengths of 250 centimeters. After a few quick hours of ripping material, it's time to create my extension strips. I've set my fence at 50 centimeters so that I can extend the length of the countertop to around 3 meters, giving myself ample room for scribing later on site. If you're using your fence as a stop on a sliding table saw, it's good form to keep the end of the fence situated before the beginning of the blade. This allows you to set your cutting distance without risk of kickback from the material getting pinched between the blade and the fence. You'll need to believe me here, but I promise you the saw is off. Next up is to mix a batch of slow cure epoxy. I'm using marine epoxy from Scribing, which is based in France. I've used their epoxy now for a few years and works really well in a wide range of applications. Once I've got my main panel laid out, I'm just rolling on the epoxy and getting an even coat on all the surfaces. It's important to give both sides a coating for ample saturation. The next step in the process is to extend my countertop by staggering and inserting what I'm going to call my spacer bars. It's a little tricky to get everything lined up and flush, but thankfully this is where the epoxy really shines. It has a long open time and allows me to really dial in my setup using a series of cauls, bar clamps, and parallel clamps. I like to start out from the middle and work my way out to the edges. This allows me to make sure I'm aligning everything correctly towards the outside edge. You can kind of think of it like pushing a wrinkle out of clothing. It pays to be extra careful during this time and monitor how everything is setting up, making any adjustments necessary for a flush surface. After transporting the cured countertop to the site, the next step is to skin the deck. I've worked for a few years as a surfboard shaper, and for me, I feel very comfortable using an electric hand planer. In general, as I'm only working with a small deviation in surface variation, I set my depth at 0.5 millimeter and do my initial pass by eye and feel. It helps to just try and be as consistent as possible and to not scrub in one area in particular. After I have my initial pass, I check and mark my progress with a straight edge and address the areas which need a little extra attention either with an orbital sander or block plane. Here I'm marking out and blocking all of the potential troubled areas where water could enter through gaps in the material for manufacturing. After flipping it over, I filled the gaps with flash cure epoxy and covered the remaining gaps with a silicone-based wood filler. Protection against water is an important factor in this build. Plywood in general isn't the first material to reach for when it comes to water resistance, but with a few extra steps, it can be a viable material for countertops. The space we're working in is quite tight and consists of 3 compound angles, aka it's completely out of square. We've decided to create a template in which we can transfer onto the countertop for an accurate fit. Using the front edge of our countertop as a reference, we scribe first the angle on the right wall and transfer it to our countertop. Now that we have the front edge of our countertop and angle for the right wall, we can accurately measure the distances for where the front and back edge of the countertop meet the angled wall on the left-hand side. Hard to follow, but as you can see, it's really nice when those moments of a little extra care pay off with a perfect fit. In order to scribe the back of the countertop, we first set the overhang of the front at the correct and equidistant position from the face of the cabinets, taking into account the doors which will be hung after and the current gap between the back of the wall and the beginning of the countertop. After a test fit, so far so good. With the countertop in place, I gave it a quick pass over with the orbital sander since we'll be marking and cutting out the recesses for the sink and stove next. There's many ways you can cut recesses, but for me, I like the accuracy of the track saw. I do it in multiple passes as I like to be extra careful at this stage. I've established my stop point and work my way through the cut. In general, I prefer to use dedicated dust collection, but it's difficult in this tight space. Normally the bag is doing an okay job, but as you can see here, it's less than ideal. Once I have my 3 cuts finished, I complete them using a thin curved pole saw. The fit turned out pretty well overall, and I'm happy with the tight tolerance. Next is installing the faucet. It's fairly straightforward, and in general the position is relative. We just chose the center point and drilled through using a 35mm Forstner bit. For the stovetop, we more or less followed the same principle, but decided to move to the other room to have a little more extra support for our cuts. Like many other woodworkers, I also enjoy using blue tape. It helps to create a very accurate and easy to see cut line. It also really helps to have an extra pair of hands for holding material and supporting cutoffs. I've also installed an overhanging faceboard on the front of the cabinet using epoxy. This needed to wait until this stage as we needed our countertop to be cut to its final dimensions before installing. Now it's on to a final sanding and to check any last troubled areas where water might collect, but overall I think it's looking pretty good. I decided to give all of the edges a round over pass using a 1/8 bit. You could also do this by hand, but I like the consistent look of a 1/8 round. The next step is to seal the countertop. I'm using 3 coats of Osmo Poly X hard wax oil. Each coat is applied lightly every 8 hours with the excess material wiped off and left to cure. After doing some water absorption tests, it seems like 3 coats really helps with creating a strong barrier against moisture. It should generally be reapplied every few months to keep things looking fresh. Once cured, I find it's a nice food-safe option which highlights the natural tones of the wood, even if it is plywood. After attaching the countertop from the underside, here it is. I think it turned out pretty nice overall, and it can be a nice custom solution using a relatively common material. I hope you were able to learn or take something from this video. I would really appreciate it if you could share it with someone who you think might enjoy it. Subscribing is always welcome, and if you made it this far, thank you.